Hello, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams. We're continuing this week in a series of lessons that have to do with the subject of celebrating God, celebrating our relationship with Him, celebrating our lives as people of faith and trust in God. Last week we looked at a passage from Psalms and First Chronicles where we saw uh, the people worshiping and celebrating and singing and dancing and praising God and focusing on all the things that they could think of, all the things they knew about God, His compassion, His love, His creativity, His omniscience, His omnipotence, uh, God being God, and just celebrating that in a time of worship and song and praise to God. This week we want to continue on with this idea of celebration. We want the purpose of today's lesson is written as to discover how to experience the experience of grace moves us to celebrate within the community of faith. What does grace have to do with our celebration? When we realize the grace that God has shown towards us, then we truly celebrate because we realize that it's unmerited favor. It's something God has given to us because God is God and God loves us. And He loves us sometimes in spite of ourselves. I feel that way about my relationship with Him sometimes. I think, Lord, I don't know how you keep putting up with me because I seem like I mess up more than I do good. But God is a God of grace, and He's a God of giving us opportunities to grow and to experience. And sometimes one of the best ways to learn is by making a mistake. And so getting out there and being active and doing things and taking a chance is an important part of our relationship with God. And in that, we experience grace and we celebrate God and how He can mold us and shape us and forgive us when we fall short, but also encourage us and empower us when we're doing the right things for the right reasons. This morning, we're going to look at uh, several parables that Jesus used in His teaching. You know, Jesus was a wonderful teacher. He was a magnificent illustrator. He was able to bring deep theological issues down into common day examples that the people he was speaking to could understand. Not only the lay people, but the Pharisees and the Sadducees could relate to these examples that he gave as well. Sometimes they related to them too well because they saw themselves as being the negative side of the parable, and that caused some friction. And certainly, uh, when we realize that we are in need of God's grace, it is a frictional kind of. We like a rule. We like a rule when we can say, "Hey, I did that." We don't like a rule when we say, "That's just too hard." Grace is where it comes in. Well, the first thing I want us to look at is a passage from Workers in the Vineyard. The landowner came to a place in the town where day workers would gather. We have a place similar to that in my can gather, and you can go by and you can say, "I need somebody to work in my yard. Are you good at trimming hedges? Are you good at running a weed eater? Are you okay with cutting grass? Are you okay with painting? You're okay?" And you can hire them for the day, and they come. Well, this landowner went to the place where people would gather to be day laborers, and he hired a crew of people to come and work in his vineyard. He started out as was a typical work day from sunup to sundown. And he began early, and he enlisted quite a few people first thing that day to come and to work in his vineyard. And the agreement was the standard day's pay. Uh, and the people agreed, the landowner agreed, all this was taken care of, and the people went and set about their work and got on with it. The atypical part of this story is that's not where it ends. The landowner went back to this place where people who wanted work were gathering several times during that day. And he enlisted more people to come and help in the vineyard. Maybe the vines were just loaded down with fresh grapes and they needed to be harvested right then. I don't know exactly what the situation was, but I know he undoubtedly felt the compulsion to need more workers. So he came back and he hired more and hired more. Uh, And the understanding was that he would be fair with them, but it wasn't necessarily promised a day's wage. Just come and help and see what we can get done. At the end of the day, the people kind of line up to get their day's pay, and the landowner starts out with those who were hired first thing in the morning, the ones who had been there all day long, from sun up to sundown. They had worked the complete day. They've worked in the heat of the day. They'd uh, taken just the breaks that they needed to take, but they stayed on task and they'd done a good job and they produced a good results for the landowner. And they received the agreed upon day's wage. And they were satisfied with that until they noticed that after them, those who started coming to get their pay were getting the same thing. And some of those people hadn't worked but just a few hours that day, maybe just one or two. And yet the landowner was giving them the same amount a day's wage as he gave to them. So they became a little disgruntled. And the landowner turned to them and he says, "Now listen, I've been fair with you. Right up front when I hired you this morning, I told you the wages for the day is this much, and you agreed, and that's what you've been given. You've done a good service. I appreciate your work, and I compensate you as I have agreed to compensate you. However, I have the ability to choose to compensate these other folks however I choose to, and I choose to show them grace." One of the things that we don't think about very much is in this society, there were a lot of people that lived from day to day, and they literally depended on that day's wage so that their family could eat the next day. And so the landowner, taking into account whatever the reasons may have been that these people were not available first thing in the morning, uh, paid them the equivalent of a day's wage so that they would be able to sustain themselves and their families through the next day, to get them through. That was not just in the sense that it was exactly what was agreed upon, but it was certainly fair and certainly a gracious thing for the landowner to do. He could have said, "Now look, you only worked 2 hours. These other folks worked 10 hours. I gave them one coin. I can only give you these copper coins," and then the people would not have had enough to get through to the next day, or they certainly would have had to scrimp on their rationing. The point here is justice versus grace. The landowner was just with his compensating everyone he asked to come and work in his vineyard. No one worked without getting compensation from him, appropriate compensation. He didn't shortchange anyone. The problem was is that he didn't shortchange anyone. Some of those who had worked hard thought they should have gotten more, since the people who worked less got the same amount as they were getting. That would be justice, wouldn't it? Tit for tat. You know. Grace, on the other hand, is the landowner who says, "I needed workers. These people were available. They came and they worked and they did the things that I asked them to do, and I'm going to be gracious in responding to their needs as well." The Pharisees could see in this how Jesus was talking about them somewhat. They were those day workers. They were those who had dedicated themselves to the service of God and to the temple and to the religious rules and regulations of their day. And they walked a fine line every day of trying to do what was appropriate and right and just according to the law. On the other hand, Jesus came and he responded to people not like them, not just like them, but different from them, in the sense that they didn't come to the synagogue. They maybe haven't had an occupation where that was excluding them sometimes from going to the temple to worship. Shepherds, for instance, because of their contact with the animals, were not allowed to do certain things in the temple because they were considered unclean. So these Sadducees and Pharisees had kind of a stilted view of themselves. Self-righteousness, we would call that today. And they said, well, I'm this and therefore you that. And that's what justice is, tit for tat. On the other hand, God says it's not about what you do so much as it is about what I do. You allow me to show grace toward you, and then my grace is sufficient to meet your needs. What a powerful story. Matthew chapter 21 through 16. We go on, and in our focal verses for today, we go to Luke, and we see three quick little parables there that Jesus used as he was teaching. Let's look at the first one. It starts off with all the tax collectors and sinners were gathered around Jesus to listen to him. The Pharisees and legal experts were grumbling, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Grumble, grumble, grumble. Sounds a little bit like the workers in the vineyard, doesn't it? Jesus told them this parable. Suppose someone among you had 100 sheep and lost one of them. Wouldn't he leave the other 99 in the pasture and search for the lost one until he finds it? And when he finds it, he's thrilled and places it on his shoulders. When he arrives home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Celebrate with me because I've found my lost sheep." In the same way, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who changes both heart and life than over 99 righteous people who have no need to change their hearts and lives. Justice, grace, righteousness is its own reward. Righteousness means that we can walk with God and have a sense of Him and of His presence and be filled with His love and empowerment every day. And that is such a rich blessing. Grace is where even those who have not been able to experience God at that level in their lives are able to see their need for God and to open their hearts, and God responds to them in great love. And there is celebration over that one who is on the outside, but who is now on the inside of God's family. Jesus goes on and he says, or what woman, if she owns 10 silver coins and loses one of them, won't light a lamp and sweep the house, searching her home carefully until she finds it? When she finds it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Celebrate with me because I found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, joy breaks out in the presence of God's angels over one sinner who changes both heart and life. The lost coin. These 10 coins probably represented the equivalent of 10 days' pay, if we want to think about it in that context. And so losing one was a whole day's worth of compensation for work. And certainly this was probably her entire savings, her entire ability to fall back on if she were sick or if something else was going on that she couldn't go out and earn that money that day, that she'd be able to sustain herself. And so losing one of those coins was a powerful thing. And it was certainly worth the time of lighting the lamp. The homes in Palestine, they didn't have windows, and they usually only had one door, and they were dark, and you'd have to light a lamp and be very careful, sweep carefully to find something as small as a coin hidden away in the corner or up under a piece of furniture or maybe on the edge of a rug. And the woman did so, and as a reward, she was able to celebrate. Thank you, Lord, for helping me regain that which was mine. Thank you for allowing me to have that sense of your empowerment and love in my life. Grace, the grace by which she seeks out that which is lost. He goes on and he tells a final parable here that we're very familiar with, the parable of the prodigal son. You know that parable. Jesus said, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. We know the rest of the story, don't we? The young son fell into dire straits. It was time he got into an area where he was not part of those people, and they didn't feel any responsibility for caring for him or taking care of him. They didn't have the Jewish mentality of caring for the stranger, the foreigner who was in their midst. And he was desolate. He was out of money and not able to uh, find work. And when he did find work, he found the lowliest of tasks of feeding the pigs. And certainly for a Jew, that was a terrible uh, kind of task to be done because pigs were considered so unclean. But yet he had to do that to sustain himself. And he comes to himself as he's doing this. And he said, remembers his father's home. In my father's home, even the servants have enough. And maybe if I go back and I ask for my father's favor, he will let me at least come and live under his roof again and come and be a part of that uh, system that he has created of family and support and working together. And he does so. And when he returns home, he finds his father waiting to welcome him. And the father just adorns him with all kinds of signs of grace and love and support. For great is the opportunity that this young son has taken. For us, sometimes we are all that prodigal son, aren't we? We pull away from God. We have maybe just an area in our lives, or maybe our whole lifestyle is contrary to God's will. But nonetheless, we have those pockets, those areas in which we pull back and we say, "No, God, I'm going to keep this for me. This is something I'm not really ready to give you yet." And so we hold back. And God says, "Oh, the blessings that I could give you, all the opportunities for service that you could have, if you could just let go of that one thing or those few things and allow me by grace to fill you and sustain you." And sometimes we get to that point where we say, "Father, I've been trying to do this on my own. I've only been thinking about myself. And I realize now that I've really messed it up. I need you. Please forgive me." God forgives. In grace, he forgives. And he allows us to be brought back into his family. Not in a subservient kind of role, but back as an equal partner. He brings us into his family. We are the sons of God through our relationship through Jesus Christ our Lord, and through our turning our lives around and being willing to seek God's will in our lives. And there is great rejoicing because you see, God, like this Father, loves us so much that it is his heart's desire for us to return into that relationship with him. You remember that story goes on. It talks about an older brother who was observing all this, and the older brother said, very similar to a lot of the other characters in some of these other parables, "Well, Father, this is not just. I've been here every day. I've worked hard. I've done this. I've done everything you've asked me to do, and you've never thrown me a feast like this." And the father says, "But son, I have been just with you. I have been faithful to you. You have never been in want. You've never been in need. You've always had an opportunity to be part of something greater than yourself. Celebrate with your brother who has realized what he has given up and lost and now can come back to it with a full sense of appreciation and focus on what is important." God's grace. It's hard to swallow sometimes, isn't it? The idea that we need grace. I like to think that I'm a pretty good fella. And yet, when I stand before God, it's only going to be the fact that Jesus is standing there with me to advocate for me that's going to allow me to hear God say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Grace. Grace that will allow me to look away from all those times that I stumbled and fell and got on the wrong track and just allowed God to show his grace towards me and bring me back into his family. Lost or found. Which are we? In what parts of our lives are we still lost even though we've been found in others? How do we bring that back together? By trusting God and seeking His will, and by saying, Father, forgive me. I hope you can do this very thing in your life. Examine it closely. It's not for me to judge you or you to judge me, but our heart bears witness with us when things aren't right. Letting God, letting God show us grace rather than doing the human kind of thing, which is to go out and try to do a bunch of good stuff to somehow, in our minds, balance the scales. God says you can't ever rebalance the scales. You are needful of my grace. For only by my grace can you be saved. God bless you. And thank you for sharing this time with me.